Nick Cook is a journalist, serial author, and researcher. He's well known for his book, The Hunt for Zero Point, Inside the Classified World of Antigravity Technology, which has links with the UFO phenomenon. More recently, he received an honourable mention in the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies essay competition for his essay, What is the Best Available Evidence for the Survival of Human Consciousness After Permanent Bodily Death? Please see the description for timestamps, relevant links, and other interviews that you might enjoy. So Nick, to start us off, can you please tell me how you first became interested in anti-gravity research and how you became inspired to write the book, The Hunt for Zero Point?
I was really dragged into the whole anti-gravity story pretty reluctantly. I was a pretty hard-bitten defense journalist working for a magazine called Jane's Defense Weekly, which was sort of, I don't know, it was kind of like the sun or the mirror of respectable trade journals, and it did have a bit of a reputation for kicking down doors. Right. It was weekly, obviously, and I really was allowed back in the 80s and 90s to indulge my interest in pretty much anything I wanted. I found myself as the aerospace editor checking out a lot of stories at the time of the late 80s, early 90s, around what we call black aircraft, classified aircraft, stealth and stuff. And it was a time of a big increase in defense budgets. Ronald Reagan was in his second presidential term. The Cold War was kind of coming to an end, but we didn't know it was coming to an end. And there were all these rumors about, mysterious classified aircraft, which used to come across my desk. And I used to travel to the US a lot. I was obviously granted pretty full access by companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing. All of those were involved in some pretty deep and classified programs. But my thing was, I've got to find out what is going on behind the scenes, particularly on the stealth question. Mm-hmm. So I was pretty used to investigating programs that were secret. What I certainly never anticipated was that I would get dragged into this whole anti-gravity thing. And that was because, broadly speaking, someone left on my desk an article which had been published in the 1950s, in which all of these aerospace companies, most of which actually the named companies in the article were sort of still going in the 1990s, which is when I saw this article. Companies like Lockheed, Boeing, General Dynamics, others. And it basically said that all of these companies and a whole lot more were investigating anti-gravity. Within 5 or 6 years, there was going to be an anti-gravity revolution. Everyone would be flying around like the Jetsons. Nothing would be in need of jet engines or, propellers anymore. And I thought, well, that's crazy. I mean, that's a really idiotic piece. I wonder who penned that. But actually, I was sufficiently intrigued to make a few phone calls. And on one of those phone calls to a public relations individual that I knew at Lockheed Martin, they basically told me to stop investigating the story. Well, that's like that moment in a thriller, where you're not going to get dragged into the plot. But if anything's going to drag you into the plot, it's someone telling you not to investigate the story. So I did. And that got me into the research for this book that I wrote called The Hunt for Zero Point, which is basically about my search for anti-gravity. It mainly took me to the US, but it was quite an extensive trek, so it took me to other places as well. But anyway, that's how I got into it, very reluctantly, but it was a very rewarding journey, as it turned out.
Yeah. So you were very reluctant at the beginning, and I wonder how long it was until you started to kind of, your mind started to open a little bit and you started to think maybe there is something to this and maybe to other things as well that you'd never considered before. But I guess, talk a little bit more about the research that went into it and how you kind of were reacting to that research as you were learning more.
Well, I knew that if there was any truth in the fact that there'd been a breakthrough back in the 50s at all, I needed to start with the science. And actually that basically meant educating myself, because whilst I could hold my own in a press conference talking about aerospace programs, when it came to raw science, pure science, I pretty much left my expertise in the classroom when I was at school, and that wasn't particularly edifying either. So I sort of bootstrapped myself on the science of gravity and also on propulsion physics. And to begin with, I knew that there was a sort of way into this story, which would be to look at it very much from a sort of what I would call a white world perspective. So check out and see what NASA was saying about propellantless anti-gravity type propulsion. Bear in mind, this was in the sort of early to mid 90s. And surprisingly, actually, there was quite a lot of activity going on. There had recently been quite a controversial story that had surfaced about a guy called Eugene Podkletnov. Podkletnov was a Russian who had claimed he could negate gravity, or rather, by altering gravity, he could change the weight of an object suspended in the gravitational column, which was about 6 inches wide, maybe 12 inches wide, a column of anti-gravitational space above a rotating superconductor, very fast rotating superconductor. And he claimed that if you suspended a weight in that space, it would lose about 2.5% of its weight, which sounds like nothing, and it isn't on the surface very much. But in physics terms, that's a lot. I mean, actually, anything would be something. So Podkletnov himself was very controversial. NASA had tried to replicate his experiments and couldn't. Podkletnov said, it's all down to the special sauce that I'm using in my superconductors, and I'm not going to give you the recipe. But this was it was like my way in. There was a sort of chink in the door. I put my foot in. Because of the credentials of my job, I was able to talk to a lot of NASA guys and others. And it was very clear that there was a lot of interest in making this happen. I mean, obviously, if you could engineer a propulsion breakthrough that was anti-gravitational, that would require fuel, this was huge. But clearly, the clues to that breakthrough in the 1950s just weren't there. So I thought, okay, so it's not happening in the white world. Maybe I better go and start kicking a few tires in the black world.
And then you did.
And then I did. And that wasn't quite as dark as it sounded, because, as I said earlier, I had been pretty involved with colleagues into looking into the whole stealth revolution at the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s. I had a lot of sources in companies like Lockheed Martin and in its skunk works. And I thought that this would be the place, to really go and look. There were certainly plenty of clues that the skunk works and other secret classified bodies in America had been experimenting with a lot of different aircraft platforms that had never seen the light of day. But I was pretty sure after some quite extensive traveling through all of those types of entities. I went out to Area 51. I spoke to a lot of people, in short. And I wasn't satisfied that there was anything, there was nothing resembling a breakthrough that was leaving its trace echoes in those companies as I saw them. Now, that's not to say that it hadn't happened, but I'm very evidence-driven. I need to see the evidence. And I think, or at least I hope, when you read the book, you see that where the evidence is clear, as it was for NASA's gravitational modification programs of the Podkletnov variety, I say it. And then when I'm uncertain about the provenance of a story, I'll say it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the interesting thing for me about doing the research for The Hunt for Zero Point was that it was unlike anything I'd ever researched before. You know, I thought that it would be a little bit like researching those classified aircraft programs of the stealth and hypersonic variety, but it wasn't like that at all. I mean, this was a massively taboo subject in the 1990s, and scientists didn't want to talk about it. Engineers didn't want to talk about it, and journalists didn't want to talk about it. The whole arena was riven with bear traps for me, and I had to move incredibly carefully, because if you openly started talking about anti-gravity propulsion and the like, and people sort of twigged what you were doing, particularly in the milieu that I worked in, because bear in mind, this was a trade publication. It wasn't a national newspaper. You know, people like me weren't meant to ask questions like that back in the day. I would probably have been out of a job. And in fact, in the book itself, I do say frequently that I'm not entirely sure when the book gets published that, you know, I'll be able to come back to a job at Jane's Defence Weekly. Now, fortunately, I was, because I had a couple of very understanding editors. I told them what I was doing, and they were all for it. But it was something that I had to keep sort of fairly sub-radar. But by the end of my trawl through that American hinterland, as I say, I still hadn't got any clue to that 1950s breakthrough that everyone was talking about in that magazine article that got plonked on my desk.
Yeah, because I've seen, you know, some of the headlines and magazine articles or whatever from around that time, and it really did. The sentiment was like, oh, we're on the, you know, the doorstep of a breakthrough, and you know, next year or next decade we're all going to be flying around in anti-gravity buses and stuff. So what is your kind of, not that I want to get spoilers from the book, I still want people to read it and enjoy it, but what's your kind of I don't know whether I want to go with your conclusions. I'm sure there's nothing definitive, but more your gut feelings, I suppose, after all of this research and talking to people and having years now to think and reflect upon all the research that you did do. Yeah. Did they make a breakthrough? Did they get really close to making a breakthrough? What's your speculations and opinions?
Okay, so bear in mind that everything I've been talking about was based on what I'd found out 20 years ago. Okay. The book came out in 2001, and it meanders extensively, not only through that landscape, the American landscape, but in order to do justice to the question of whether there'd been a 1950s breakthrough, I had to go back in time as well as research in the present. And that took me to Nazi Germany.
Right, yeah.
Again, during the war. And again, I was extremely reluctant to do this because I knew that it was riven with all kinds of sort of twisted myths and legends. It would be very hard indeed to unravel any of that stuff. But again, I was sort of, the reporter instinct in me said, I can't duck it, I've got to do it. So I went back into the archives, found a lot of very interesting references to putative German unconventional aircraft programs. Couldn't say with any definition that they were anti-gravity in origin, but they were certainly very interesting. I had an aerospace background. I was an aerospace editor. A lot of this stuff was new to me. A lot of the files that I was uncovering were new files. They hadn't been investigated before. And again, having moved through that German landscape, the one thing that and I don't want to give away the book is written a bit like a thriller, because in a previous life, I was a thriller writer, and actually I still am. But it's a non-fiction book, but to sort of propel the narrative, I wrote it as it happened, but, you know, hopefully using sort of cliffhanger-ish techniques. But the big thing that came out of my Nazi German investigation was the fact that the Germans had set up their own top secret special projects office, which had looked at all the sorts of things that American top secret special projects offices like the Skunk Works and other classified program offices had been delving into. But also what had happened was that at the end of the war, a lot of that infrastructure to keep things secret that the Allies had found in Nazi Germany had been transported back to America. And so that whole black world infrastructure of heavily secret, compartmentalized programs where one guy working in one office on the same program wouldn't know that the guy working maybe 2 doors down is also working on that program because they're not allowed to talk to each other. And that's how it is. That's how things get kept secret. That system was really devised in Germany in a very brutal way. So some of that is carried forth now into the American hinterland, where you have a very aggressive infrastructure, as we've seen recently. Anyone who's followed any of the goings on Capitol Hill into the UAP or UFO investigations being carried out by Congress at the moment, will know that there is a very draconian set of secrecy rules around people who work in that environment. But a lot of that was transported back from Nazi Germany at the Second World War, and not just into America. Other allies did it as well. So at the end of all of that, I'm not going to spoil the plot of the book because there are some quite interesting conclusions that I come to. But I can tell you now that the certitudes I felt I had at the end of the book are not quite as rock solid as they were then. And I do think there's some pretty good evidence that surfaced more recently, actually, that there has been some kind of propulsion breakthrough particularly in the American environment. And I think we can talk about whether that is been given any assistance from crash retrieved, unidentified flying objects. But I'm talking about man-made stuff, stuff that has been devised and engineered purely, exclusively from the brains of human beings. And I think that there is some circumstantial evidence now to say that those sorts of programs and perhaps a limited breakthrough may have been achieved.
Yeah. There must be so much going on that we have no idea about, right? Like behind the scenes in the black with the technologies and propulsion and everything like that. Like the mind boggles my mind boggles when I think about, where we actually are, where humanity actually is in comparison to where we're told we are, if you see what I mean.
I do. And, I base a lot of my views on the fact that, as I said at the beginning, 25 years ago, I was running around with fairly good access to program engineers who were doing very secret things. And even they couldn't, when they talked about stuff and when they revealed stuff to me in a very limited way. I mean, the black world security regime is black to keep secrets there. So then people just wouldn't blab routinely or even non-routinely to people like me. What you had to do to build up a picture of what was going on purely in the conventional black aerospace world, you had to do through looking at myriad clues, obviously talking to lots of people, analyzing the data. And this was just for conventional aircraft. So you can imagine, as you say, that anything surrounding something more exotic, either man-made anti-gravity stuff, or something surrounding a crash-retrieved non-human aerospace vehicle, a space vehicle. Those sorts of restrictions in place to keep that stuff secret would just be astronomical.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess since we kind of dipping our toes into that area, let's move on to that. And I'd love to know when UFOs first kind of I mean, I'm sure you were aware of them for a long time before you took them seriously. Well, it's a speculation on my part, but yeah, tell me how they first entered your world and what your kind of initial thoughts were. And I'm guessing there was a significant overlap while you were researching for your book, The Hunt for Zero Point.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, so I started working at Jane's Defence Weekly in 1986, I think. I had zero interest in UFOs. I don't think I'd ever read a UFO book. Nothing like that had ever crossed my, just come to my attention. And then when this article landed on my desk, I did hunt out a few UFO books because I wanted to see what was sort of in the public domain, what was being read about UFOs, because I knew that had there been an aerospace propulsion breakthrough in the 1950s to yield an anti-gravity effect, this thing was going to look a lot like a UFO. So I needed to bone up on the whole UFO field. So I did read a few books at the time, mid-90s. I used to get people who rang into, the magazine going, I've seen something over my house or at the end of my garden. I couldn't explain it. It didn't look like an aircraft. Here's a picture of it. But again, back in the late 80s, early 90s, because of that taboo factor, I literally, I'm ashamed to say, I just put those letters and those photographs straight in the bin. I just wasn't interested. But little by little, as this, this investigation into anti-gravity began, I became more and more conversant, if you like, with what was going on in the UFO world. But then when the book came out in 2001, I literally stopped all my activity in researching that stuff. Stopped. I considered it job done. I went back to my job at Jane's for a bit. I wrote books whilst I had been at Jane's. So I'd always been a writer. I ghost wrote some stuff. So I was doing a lot of things. And I just thought, well, I've done that subject. I'm not going to return to it. I'm just going to go on to other things, which I did do. And then in 2017, I suppose, like so many of us, the New York Times article came to my attention. And for those that don't know it, it was written by Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and some staffers on the New York Times. And it was telling the story of a top secret unit within the Pentagon, they said, that had been studying UFOs for a long time, even though officially there was no sanction within the DoD to study UFOs. So this thing had been going on the quiet. And I thought, well, actually, that's quite an interesting development. And I felt that it might even herald the beginning of a new era, one in which all of that taboo sort of don't go there admonition that I'd been given when I was researching the Hunt for Zero Point. I thought, well, maybe that's going away now. Maybe it's okay for people like me to stick their head above the parapet and go, okay, so what's with all of this UFO stuff? Yeah. And I noticed more and more people in the engineering community starting to talk about it. And I think, I know Leslie Kean, and I think that people like me and anyone who's interested in the UFO field do owe her and her colleagues an enormous debt of gratitude, because they literally took the lid off that subject and opened it up to scrutiny. Not that it was a clean sheet and everyone was, openly able to talk about this stuff, obviously, but it did remove a lot of the stigma around it. And of course, in the years since, so what was that? 6 years ago, almost, that stigma has been progressively removed. And, here we are today, me holding a discussion about anti-gravity, UFOs, and UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, to give it its proper, its politically correct title.
Although technically, isn't it now unidentified anomalous phenomena? That's the very latest, isn't it? Because it keeps getting tweaked, doesn't it?
No, you're so right. I'm steeped in words of I'm a couple of acronyms back, but yeah, no, unidentified anomalous.
Yeah. But what a wild 6 years. You're so right about how it's progressively, the taboo's been going away. I mean, it's been crazy, like the change when you look back to, say, a year before the Times article, or even a month before the Times article, and how different like everything is now, like the narrative, the stuff that's actually happening, as you said, with the hearings and stuff. And it's time I ask you about, David Grusch, of course. So what were your thoughts when that first, hit the airwaves and when that first came to light? When was it now? Was it July? Early July? It's all kind of a blur.
He had his session before the
that was July.
That was in July.
So it must have been.
I'm guessing it was probably a month or a good couple of months before then that he surfaced.
Yeah. So May, June kind of time. But yeah, so what are your thoughts on David Grusch? What are your thoughts on his claims or his testimony, everything that he said under oath even? Particularly I'm wondering about, the recovered craft, obviously, and then the spicier element of the non-human biologics, as is kind of quoted so often now, the idea of these non-human bodies or pilots of said craft that have been recovered. How did you digest all of that, and what do you think about it all?
Well, I'm immensely persuaded by him. I haven't met him, but I know lots of people who have met him and more. They know him really quite well, and I'm basing some of my analysis on what they tell me. They're very well plugged into the community, and they assess him to be kosher, genuine. He's obviously made a plethora of claims, from the fact that crash retrieved non-human vehicles have been recovered since I think 1933 in Italy, which was new to I think all of us, through to the fact that these programs, these crash retrieved UAP programs, are embedded in US industry and outside the halls of government. And of course, this is the bugbear of government, in that the real hardcore secret, if you like, is outside of its purview and outside of its control, and it wants it back. And this is one of the more startling elements of this whole story, which is that if we go down the road of, yes, crash retrieved alien, and I'm using alien in a very general sense here, because I think perhaps a better term would be non-human craft. Those if we get down the road that there have been crashes of non-human craft, then what we are told is that at a certain time, probably in the 1950s, to avoid scrutiny, they were passed to companies, corporations, and also into certain entities, most of them aligned to the Department of Energy, that were absolved from scrutiny. So this may explain why attempts to look into, government records and find this stuff have produced effectively null result, because they're not there. They've just been moved into other places. So, but that is, that now the government wants its stuff back. And we're seeing that pursued with great vigor on Capitol Hill by, most recently, by a committee of Congress people. I think that was on July 26th, which was the Grusch hearing. And it's pretty clear to me that there is stuff there. I mean, I don't think all of these people would be as exercised as they are about what they say is hidden away if they didn't think it was hidden away. So I think it's going to be a pretty interesting time over the next few years to see whether they actually recover it. I think they've got their hands full, because what we've seen since all the progress you alluded to, Ben, was a sort of pretty significant, what I call a walkback campaign, both by the DoD, by the intelligence community, and people who don't want this stuff out in the open. But we can talk about the timetable of disclosure, if you like. But suffice to say, I guess 6 years on, almost, after that New York Times article came out, I can't believe quite where we are today, which is, as you say, we've had that revelation in the New York Times. We've had a report in 2021 from the DoD and the intelligence community saying that the phenomenon is real. That was new. And we've had various other reports since, most recently one from NASA, all acknowledging the reality of the phenomenon, and now saying they want to get their teeth into actually what it is. But as you and I both know, sort of, whilst there's lots of obfuscation around, okay, so the phenomenon's real, but are we talking Russian, Chinese, classified American stuff? No. What we're all interested in, and actually what everyone is now zeroing onto, is whether the exotic stuff that people see in the sky performs impossible maneuvers. Is that non-human derived? And that is what the focus of people's inquiry is now on. And we'll see whether we're at a sort of quite a pivotal point. We'll see whether there's sufficient momentum for that inquiry to progress, or whether it will be snuffed out to a degree by that walkback campaign from insiders in the intelligence community and in corporate America, where the stuff purportedly is hidden.
Yeah. So you've obviously got a lot of connections in corporate America where a lot of this stuff could be hidden. So have you kind of, when all this came out, did you you must have started to think, I wonder who do I think, has a who would they have given bits of craft to, and can I ring up this person? Did you ever hear anything about this? Has your mind been working like that when you heard about this coming out? Obviously, it was not the first time that we suspected that things would be held in private aerospace. I'm not saying that. Of course, you've obviously had that. You were aware that was a possibility beforehand, but everything kind of changed a bit when Grusch said these things under oath and what have you. So, yeah. Where do you think they are? Have you kind of given much thought to it?
Well, I think like classified aircraft programs themselves, which, as we've discussed earlier, are heavily compartmentalized. I suspect that, wherever this secret is hidden, it's very spread out, so that very few people, if anyone at all, has all the pieces of the puzzle, because those individuals are vulnerable to blowing secrets. And so I suspect it's spread all over corporate America, but not just corporate America. There are national laboratories as well, which are exempt from scrutiny in the normal way by Freedom of Information Act requests. Mm-hmm. So the pieces of this puzzle are going to be spread far and wide. And, I sort of laugh sometimes when I see skeptics try and kill the whole idea that this subject is real based on a single data point. If they're talking about, the performance of a purported UFO on a piece of video because it doesn't behave in a particular way, come on, guys, there is so much data out there. It's the overwhelming preponderance of the data which is convincing. No single data point is ever going to persuade me or most sane-minded people that something is real, and nor should it persuade a skeptic. But if you look at the totality of the data, you have to assemble this story like a jigsaw puzzle. And what the data says is it's real. There is clear evidence of exotic aerospace vehicles that perform in ways that nothing we know of that we've built performs like that. That evidence exists. There's pretty compelling evidence, I think, that a lot of this stuff, if not all of it, has not been built by us. So it is some of it is at least non-human in origin. We then have to delve into the question of what is non-human. As I've said before, the description alien is not good enough for me, because I don't think a description which would have all of this stuff coming from interstellar space, in other words, other star systems and planets, that certainly doesn't cut it. Some of them maybe, but certainly not all of them. And there's evidence too for crash retrievals. So all in all, when you put all of this together, you have to say there is a thing here. It exists.
There's a there.
But there's a there. And we've just got to see whether we get shown it in a kind of disclosed way in the months and years ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree totally. Do you what would satisfy you in terms of verifying not the whole, not everything, in terms of Grusch's claims, I suppose, let's say, what would satisfy you to say, that's for me, that's done, that's the book's closed, that's 100%, or 99.999 recurring? What would it take for you to be completely, and I know you said you're very confident in him right now, and so am I take him very seriously. I take him at his word. I have no reason to disbelieve anything he's said, really. But yeah, that's different to having verification. So what would it take for you to be totally convinced by that?
Well, I think obviously the most obvious thing, perhaps the first thing that would convince me, would be a government announcement. A government announcement saying, we have a program. It has existed since X date, Y date. It consists of this. Here are some photographs, with or without bodies. Why would that convince me? Well, we all know that data can be faked, but no government has any interest really in putting this story out there unless it's true. So an admission by a government, but of course the US government first and foremost, that there is that there is a program in all of this, would be the first thing. Secondly, would be an independent panel of scientists who would go in then and look at it and kick the tires and so forth, and publish their own findings back. But effectively, once you've had an official government admission of a program, whether that is a terrestrial anti-gravity program, a non-human anti-gravity craft of some description, or a hybrid of the two, any admission on a government level to that, to those sorts of programmatics would be enough for me to go, okay, now we are going to truly throw open the doors and see what we've got. I think there is, based on people I've spoken to who I think should know, or at least are in a much better position than me to know, I think there is the beginnings of a kind of controlled disclosure program happening. I think those in the know, or at least with limited knowledge, know that you can't keep a lid on this forever. But like you've got to release the pressure on that lid slowly in order for there not to be too much ontological shock, amongst all of us. I mean, I've been looking at this for a while, and I would still be astounded, if and when the day comes when somebody says all of this stuff is real. But to anyone who, and we know, who has never even heard of any of the stuff that we're talking about, Ben, for them, this is going to come as a huge shock. So I feel it's on its way, and I think it's happening. And I think, occasionally we get the bottle top is loosened and pressure is let out of the bottle, and then it's squeezed. The bottle cap is pushed back on again, and the pressure builds. But I think that we're in that phase now. I think there's a little bit of release, a little bit of put the genie back in the bottle, out it comes again. I think we're on that path.
Yeah, I think so. And I hope so. When you were talking, then I had a kind of image in my mind of a dam. And, I'm thinking this 2017 article is, it knocks a little bit of the dam out. So there's some water coming through. And obviously we have these factions in government that are trying to, fix it as it's leaking. And then Grusch comes up with a massive club, just smashes a hole through this dam. And it's still there. It's still standing. But I don't know if they're going to manage to repair it before it completely busts through, as you say.
Well, he made a pretty big hole, but it's not so.
There's still a long way to go.
That dam's cracking just yet. I think there's some way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a few more Grushes come forward, and it could kind of change things a little bit. Obviously, it's still people without hard evidence. That's not going to win the day, but it makes an enormous difference in terms of pushing the conversation forward. A couple of quick questions on the UFO phenomenon before we kind of move on to something a little bit different. So disclosure process, you mentioned it a minute ago. Again, we could speculate about it for some time, but just in kind of a nutshell, what's your gut feeling? It's speculation, of course. 6 months, a year, earlier this year, there were lots of people coming out and saying this summer's going to be, it's all going to be out the bag. We're going to have disclosure of a non-human intelligence. I don't know if I can get behind, anything happening this year in terms of that. But yeah, what do you think? When are we going to have a big disclosure? What's the disclosure going to be? How soon is it? Et cetera, et cetera.
Well, it is impossible to say, of course. And, I, like you earlier in the year, I thought that we might have something pretty soon, actually, because it all seemed to be accelerating exponentially quickly. And then we had this kind of, walk back campaign, and, the efforts that we've just been discussing about putting the lid back on, closing, shutting the pressure down. So it's really, really difficult to say. But there is a wild card factor in all of this, which we may be able to get onto when we start to talk about consciousness, as I know you do, which is, it's not all down to us, I don't think.
Right.
Which sounds incredibly woo, but the more I've observed the phenomenon itself, and this isn't original. Funnily enough, I've just been reading John Keel. I don't know whether you've read his book, The Trojan Horse, but Operation Trojan Horse. But Keel observed back in the late 1960s that there was a dynamic aspect to the phenomenon itself, in that we humans could be running around investigating all of this stuff, but in essence, it always seemed to be one step ahead of those investigations. Itself was maneuvering to do things to confound you, the investigator. I mean, Keel found that a lot. I sense a similar pattern now. So there are, for all of the intense efforts by security people to put a lid on all of this stuff to stop it from happening, every now and again we see the phenomenon itself act in a strange way. And I think we were treated to an example of this at the beginning of the year, where we had that Chinese balloon cross the United States and get shot down by an F-22 with a short-range missile. And that was real enough in that it was a Chinese balloon. There are then 3 other shoot-down incidents, which, to my mind, again, having covered the military and the Air Force in particular for a long time while I was at Jane's Defence Weekly, it beggars belief to me that the wreckage from those 3 objects, which were supposedly shot down, has never been recovered. So, I then have to look at that and go, no, that's just not what.
I know.
So then, what are you covering up? What don't you want to talk about here? Now, I'm not saying that those 3 objects were UFOs, but I am saying that something about the phenomenon bends and twists reality in strange ways just when you think the status quo has been restored. So just when the status quo has been restored, that Chinese balloon has been shot down, and we can all breathe freely and sleep in our beds because we're not about to be invaded by the People's Liberation Army. Something weird happens, and those 3 UFOs appear, and they are genuine UFOs because no one's identified them. Whether they are of non-human intelligence origin or whether they are just terrestrial, we don't know what they are, but they are genuine UFOs. And the phenomenon behaves in a strange way, leading us all to think even more about what it is that we're dealing with. And I think actually that's what it's teasing us and begging us to do, is to look at our reality around us and question it, actually, and go, this hard physical thing that we think of as reality, is it as hard and physical as we think it is? Or might it be constituted of stuff we don't understand? And actually, that's where I found myself going more and more in my more recent researches.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, we're going to get on to some more of that kind of the consciousness side of things in just a minute. Just before we do, I mean, the shoot-downs, I don't know how they keep going out of my mind. I keep kind of not thinking about them, and then somebody mentions them and I'm like, yeah, it was beyond strange, that whole affair. And it was all on the news, breaking news. Oh, there's another one. Oh, pilots are saying that it's octagonal and it's like that it's staying afloat in Windsor Loft, and all of these strange things coming out. And I don't know if even those things were true. When looking back, I don't. It's all bit the waters have been muddied, and it's all kind of bizarre. But as you say, the most powerful, the most technologically advanced country on Earth as we know it wanted to shoot down these unidentified objects for reasons of national security, and we're expected to believe that they couldn't even find them. Come on, I mean, I don't care where it is. I don't care. It's the most inhospitable, inaccessible place in the world. You've got quite a few resources, find it.
Thinking about the United States and well, to a degree, the Canadians as well. The most powerful military on Earth searching for something that's basically fallen on its own soil, and it can't find it.
Something that they shot down as well, so they should have had the radar tracks, and they should have known approximately.
I'm smiling only because it's as we discuss this, it's a day or two after the United States lost one of its F-35 jets after the pilot had ejected.
Yeah,
conscious that actually this can happen with real stuff as well. But yeah, it beggars belief that's going to happen. And a second thing, actually, to be honest, beggars belief for me. I'm no longer a reporter. I haven't been a reporter for years. But by God, if I were in Washington or anywhere in America, or even actually if I were just covering that Pentagon intelligence community beat still, I would want to know. I would want to talk to everyone I possibly could to find out what had happened on those 3 shoot-downs. And the disappointing thing, I think, is an apparent lack of curiosity by the press corps that I used to consider mine, which was the intelligence and defense press corps, just not exhibiting any interest in a story that actually has a real footprint. Bits of wreckage crashed somewhere in North America and were shot down by real F-22s firing real missiles. There's enough of a trail there to get your teeth into a story, but apparently it's not interesting enough to merit any investigation by that press corps. And that to me is extraordinary. There is one other point though, which is raised by your question, which is as the information flows in to both conceal and add to a story like that, the information comes in from multiple sources. Something very strange happens. I touched on it already. But it is if our own efforts to, put layers of information on top of an incident like that have the curious effect of distorting reality. Jacques Vallée, who's a UFO investigator, I'm sure you heard of, may even have interviewed, but
unfortunately not yet.
He's written a great canon of literature on the subject, and I'm an admirer of his work. He and Eric Davis, a physicist who will be known to people who've covered the crash retrieval story because of a rather infamous memo that he's reputed to have written after meeting one Admiral Tom Wilson, who was trying to investigate the crash retrieval story. But Jacques Vallée and Eric Davis wrote a paper about the different levels of high strangeness you get in proximity to a UFO encounter. And it starts pretty prosaically, but when you get to the 6th level of high strangeness, reality is literally getting bent out of shape in such strange ways that you're getting, everything comes in on top of the original UFO sighting, from poltergeist phenomena to cryptozoological creatures in the vicinity of the sighting to all kinds of weird psychic phenomena. And I would say that this, the shoot down of those 3 UFOs after the balloon incident sort of falls somewhere in about the first third of high strangeness. It's moved out of being a pure piece of investigation and reportage into a really weird sort of distorted story that somehow has been bent out of shape by what? Well, maybe it's the phenomenon itself is doing some of that bending.
Some of that manipulating of how we see things or even different physical stuff. But yeah, I mean, the last thing we'll say on the shoot-downs is I just can't emphasize enough how you said you were smiling because you just can't believe it. And I was the same. I was kind of listening to you and kind of half almost laughing just because I'm literally laughing at the idea of all this stuff happened and the news took it seriously for a day or two. Like, it was huge news. And then just, sweep that one under the rug. Never mention that one again. Don't remind them about that for some reason, for some unknown. And I'm not even convinced that they would have been extraordinary UFO, like non-human UFOs. I mean, maybe. I'm not going to rule it out. But
could have been.
It's just so bizarre. If it would be, for me, that's like how to handle a situation badly and make people suspicious that there's something going on. Do that, basically.
Yeah,
Wild.
It as I said, it defied understanding to me.
Yeah.
I didn't understand.
Same with the media response. Yeah, same exact thing.
Yeah.
You've kind of alluded to it a little bit, and I'm assuming you have no definitive conclusion yourself, at least in your own mind, in terms of origins here for the extraordinary UFOs, UAP, the ones that we do, the non-human, seemingly non-human UFOs, UAP. You kind of hinted that maybe some could be interstellar, interplanetary, the classic kind of alien, as it were. And absolutely there could be some of that going on. But what's your thoughts in general on origins? Do you think we're looking at multiple different phenomena taking place at once. I've obviously, you're aware of Jacques Vallée, you just mentioned. I think he thinks along the interdimensional lines, which kind of is I struggle to wrap my head around sometimes. You got Dr. Michael Masters, who's a big proponent of the future human hypothesis. Lots of different kind of lenses to look at it through. Where do you stand? Again, I know we're in gut feeling territory, so that's all I'm asking for.
Sure, and it really is only gut feeling territory, but those extraterrestrial vehicles, if there are any at all, would constitute a very small proportion, in my view. I find it, I struggle to understand, given the immense number of sightings that there are, daily, if not, weekly, if not daily, that they're all coming from, other star systems. It sort of doesn't seem to make much sense. But I'm increasingly drawn to an ultra-terrestrial hypothesis or an interdimensional hypothesis, which is that this is a phenomenon that has been here probably since forever, or at least for a very long time. And we have been unaware of it as it has existed alongside us. It's easier to conceive of that if you take the technology away and just think about a non-human intelligence presence that's probably here on Earth, and as I say, has been for a very long time. So an ultra-terrestrial hypothesis could encompass a hidden civilization. I find that quite hard to believe. Are there real physical three-dimensional beings that are, deep underwater, somewhere in the Arctic or the Antarctic, with craft that can do all the things that people say they do when they are seen in the sky? Well, maybe, but it could be a bit of that, but I find that harder to believe than an interdimensional twist on that, which is that these things are coming in and out of our dimension using a technology that literally is beyond our comprehension. And that for a very narrow window in time, as they pass through our dimension, we see them. That leads to some very strange translation effects as they penetrate our dimension, come in, go out. You tend to hear about that in some of the sightings data that people report. It's very strange shapes. People see the morphing as it happens, from something quite indistinct and irregular in terms of a shape. Perhaps it starts as a blinding light or something a little plasma-like, and then it morphs into a recognizable shape of a classic saucer or some kind of aerial craft. So there's that too, and then there is the future human one, which I think has merit as well. So kind of the long and the short of it then is that it's all of the above. But I also think that the thing that we are not doing is we're paying it. What we are doing is we're paying attention to the objects in the sky. What we're not doing is paying so much attention to the substrate, that the reality substrate that gives rise to the things in the sky. And I think that when that happens, we're going to have a much more interesting discussion on all of this, because it's a little bit like gravity. We don't understand what gravity is. So when we know what it does, but we don't understand where it comes from. So when I started investigating the anti-gravity story, people said, anti-gravity, that's crazy shit. And I would go, well, since we don't know what gravity is, how can we say with any great definition what anti-gravity is or isn't?
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like that, I think, about reality. Reality we take for granted. This wall feels and is solid, but I know it's made of atoms that are 99.99999% empty space.
Yeah.
but something translates that empty space into solidity, into my three-dimensional world here. And that isn't very well explained, actually. So until we can get a handle on what the physics of our reality is, I feel that we're not really going to make as much progress as we'd like with the whole UAP question, because actually it could be any or all of the things that we discussed. And it could be, and there's another layer on top of it as well, which is what we bring to the party. I mean, our consciousness, my consciousness, what I bring to my interface with reality is somehow reflected back at me in ways that I don't understand. But I've got a feeling that I am a part of the mix as well. You know, it's the classic quantum mechanics observer in the loop thing. An observer in the loop affects the outcome of a quantum mechanical experiment. I, into the interface of reality, bring my all my baggage of who I am to that interface, and somehow I myself am manipulating the reality that I see. So it's an immensely complex question about what it is that people see in the sky. And it is no one thing. Oh, and we've left out, of course, the fact that we've got our own deeply classified aerospace vehicles flying around there as well.
Of course.
So, it's a jungle out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's so many different ways I could go from here. There's so many things I want to talk to you about. What I wanted to ask you now is I wanted to touch on a kind of more dicey area of this phenomenon, something that probably when you were first getting into it, I know when I was first getting into this area, this was something very uncomfortable to consider. It still is really in a lot of ways. That's the abduction phenomenon, right? So UFO abductions, non-human intelligence. Is there really a non-human intelligence taking people out of their daily lives, and or have they been at some point? Again, I know we're in speculation. You can't tell me anything with certainty, but what are your feelings on that? Is that something that's quickly floating to the surface, and is that going to be something that is going to be in a lot of questions very soon? Yeah, where do you stand on it all?
Well, I tell you what, actually, Ben, I'll be honest. I've not really. I mean, I've read about it. I've treated it seriously, and I do treat it seriously, but I wouldn't pretend to know very much about it. I have met a few experiences, but compared with all the other data points and the things we're discussing, I don't have a tremendous amount to say about abduction.
Yeah.
I know it's a thing. I know it's real, but I don't pretend to understand a fraction of it, to be honest. And for that reason, I'd probably steer clear of talking about it in any depth now, beyond saying it deserves to be studied seriously.
Even if it's quite scary, the idea of it, because when we boil it down to the most basic form, that's what it is, right? There's some kind of non-human thing here. If it's real, if it's happening, there's some kind of non-human presence here, literally taking us off the ground out of our lives and doing various testing or things with us, and then sometimes putting us back, and maybe sometimes not. Again, that's a whole other potential kind of worms.
Well, I think it's not even if it's scary to do so, but because it is scary.
Yeah.
That we need to study it. In fact, all of this needs to be studied. And there are some very uncomfortable elements about it. I think Lou Elizondo has referred to, some of the uncomfortable truths that we're probably going to have to confront when this stuff, starts tumbling out more and more. And, when did science ever shy away from something because it was scary? Science needs to be all over this, whether it's scary or not. But because there are scary elements to it, all the more reason, I would say, for science to dive in with both feet. We might not like what we find, but we've got to find it out. We've got to humanity has to grow up.
Yeah.
We want to be, if we want to be big boys in this whole arena, we've got to take this whole thing responsibly, and science has to take it seriously.
Yeah, same for various other topics. Science needs to catch up a little bit and wake up a little bit, or mainstream science at least, the kind of societal science. So leading from the abductions into a question that's kind of probably going to be at the forefront of everybody's mind if and when something is revealed to be interacting with our planet or with us. Are they friendly? Are they neutral? Are they hostile? Are they just like us? Like, because again, what are humans? Are we friendly, neutral, hostile? All of the above. So do you think it's going to be the same case with whatever is here? Or, do you lean one way or another? Because obviously some people lean, I spoke to somebody recently, Preston Dennett. He's been a UFO researcher for like 35 years. He's very much on the case of, I think they're friendly. I think they're here either to help us or, to help us in some ways, even if not, they're not coming here necessarily as our saviors or something, but he's very much on the side of, I think they're friendly. And then you've got, David Jacobs and other researchers who are very much on the side of they're scary and bad and mean, and they want to, kill us or whatever they want to do. They want our planet. So do you have a stance here at all, or are you kind of just keeping skin out of the game on that for now?
The first thing that I try and sort of get my head around is seemingly we're not dealing with one form of intelligence. It strikes me that this is within the phenomenon of non-human intelligence, there is just about every stripe and shade. In fact, I'd be really surprised if there weren't, given what we said earlier. If this is interdimensional, ultra-terrestrial, and all the rest, and maybe extraterrestrial too, then we have to accept that there is going to be a wide variety of forms, bringing all kinds of demeanors to the table. Some of that, I mean, again, it's probably we're characterizing all of this in very human, three-dimensional
anthropology.
Absolutely, and that just may be completely inappropriate. So, but we tend to do it. It's a natural thing. So binary terms like, good or bad or good and evil, I try and get away from. I mean, Ingo Swann, who was a remote viewer, in fact, the original remote viewer for the CIA, I knew Ingo quite well, and he would refer to energies and forces, which he encountered in his sort of remote viewing activity. What did he mean by energies and forces? Essentially, as I understood it, indistinct, shapeless energy that could twist and form into just about any manifestation that we as humans could witness or encounter. So if there's any truth at all to that, then there really is an infinite number of types of intelligence that we may encounter. And some of it is going to be good, and some of it, by our standards, is going to be bad. And we need to be ready for that. But again, we can't shy away from it. It would be irresponsible not to investigate it and to decide where we, as human consciousness, sits in the spectrum of intelligences that I think increasingly seem to be out there. Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it? I'm just thinking now, if somebody on another planet or some being on another planet is doing a podcast interview, and they're aware of us on our planet, and they've studied us for a long time. They have a lot of information about us, and they're saying, "Oh, so those humans over on Earth, we call it Earth. Do you think they're good, bad, evil, neutral? Are they, what are their intentions? What are their, because I couldn't even really answer that question. I mean, could you answer that? Are we good? Are we bad?" I know we're using those basic terms again.
I don't even know that the question would compute or is relevant, because
that's true.
It would be, perhaps it might be as relevant as us looking at an ant colony and
Yeah.
going, "Hey, are those ants good or bad?"
Well, they
Just
might be. They might be one or the other, but they're probably neither, and that's probably the point. We're probably neither, and maybe there is no such thing as, unless you become like a hive mind kind of civilization. Maybe there's no such thing as one civilization that's just has a label on it of they're positive or negative. Maybe it's always going to be like this, just chaos in a way.
I'll tell you what, though, if they do come here either interdimensionally or from another star system and take a look at us, God knows what they must be thinking when they turn up. Because what they wouldn't see is one species acting intelligently and coherently. They'd see a bunch of, they'd see us all fighting against each other, destroying the planet, behaving in the most irresponsible way for what we think of ourselves as an advanced civilization. I mean, again, I don't even know. It beggars belief to understand what they would make of us doing what we do. I mean, even to my mind, and I'm from this neighborhood, it is just crazy.
Yeah,
it
is.
Anyway, there we are. They'll come here, and I suspect because of that, they'll see us like ants, and they'll see the ant colony fighting with itself, other parts of the ant colony destroying their habitat, and just basically shrugging their shoulders and throwing up their arms and going, we took a wrong turn.
Yeah, no, totally. And to take your ant metaphor a little bit further. So let's say we find a big old ant colony somewhere, some remote part of whatever you want, desert, rainforest, doesn't matter. We find a big colony of ants, and we get further in our study of these ants than we ever have in the past, and we start to figure out ants have language, and we're like, wow, this colony of ants has like 300 languages they use. They all talk different languages. They've cut their colony into all these various compartments, literally hundreds of compartments, and they all talk different. Most of them can't understand each other. They're all talking like different things, literally in terms of the words, but also they all want different things. It's wild, isn't it? Because if we discovered a planet out there somewhere in the in our universe, in our galaxy, and we found out that there was life there and X, Y, and Z, and they're somewhat like us in some ways, or they seem to be. And then you think, wow, just the fact that we've cut up our planet into all these dividing areas and we have all these language, that is wild. Like, if you take away our context, our knowledge of being human and what we are used to and familiar with, that seems like strange to me. You never see it in the alien films, do you?
Very unfair.
They always...
Because I think ants behave a lot more coherently than
civilized,
so perhaps in the mindset of a non-human intelligence, if such a thing exists, I suspect they would look at us and just think that we've lost any right to the planet that we're on. And if there is a non-human intelligence that is embedded behind some veil, and we can't see that non-human intelligence, but it's here, I suspect that's how they might think of us, which is this irritant on this planet has given up any right to call it its own.
I like that,
and nor should we. Increasingly, if you look at the Earth as a system and a system of systems, we're just part of the system, a small part of the system, and yet we have wrecked it. And at some point, either the system itself or another part of the system is going to go, this human entity has just foregone any right to be here anymore. Because it doesn't behave with good stewardship.
No, not even close. We don't even try, really, do we? Have you seen the film The Day the Earth Stood Still?
I've not, but I know I know what you mean.
I watched it only recently for the first time, and it really hit home. It was like, it was very matter of fact. It was just like, I'll try not to give everything away, but basically, this non-human being comes here tasked with the mission, of kind of either deciding that we can be trusted to stay here, or if we're not going to completely change everything, just to terminate us. Quite simply, I think, really, it's just like the planet is the priority at the end of the day. The planet sustains hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of various life forms of different types. There's one of them that's just destroying it all. So it doesn't... we're a wild species. Let's talk a little bit about potential overlaps, links, gray areas, blurry areas, parallels, however many describing words we want to use for the connection between UFOs or the UFO phenomenon, consciousness, psi phenomena, even survival of death or the afterlife, all of these various aspects. What are your thoughts on all of those things I said? Blurry lines, connections, overlaps. Where do you stand on all that?
Okay, so when I sort of entered the UFO field, and as we spoke about a bit earlier, that was sometime after 2017 when the New York Times article came out. Mm-hmm. And I started talking to people who'd stuck their head above the parapet. One thing I realized very quickly, which was if I was going to do any kind of research in the field at all, what it couldn't be was in the nuts and bolts domain. I'd done that. The Hunt for Zero Point is effectively a nuts and bolts story. It looks at a very small part of the phenomenon and goes, did we build it? Did humans build that stuff? So to make sense of something that was considerably more complex, what I knew I needed to do was to come at it from a completely different angle. And that angle to me was consciousness, because nothing else could explain the variety of the variety of the phenomena, the strangeness of the phenomena, all of that stuff. But there was a problem in that I knew nothing about consciousness. I'd not studied it at all. I'd read articles about it. I was interested, of course. We all contemplate about what it is that makes us aware and self-aware and all the rest of it. But I'd never given it any real thought. So I had to sort of bootstrap myself very quickly into the consciousness education realm. I had one thing to help me. And I'm not going to go into this in any depth because it goes into perhaps parts of the discussion we can have at a future date. But in 2014, so 3 years before the New York Times article came out, I happened to be at the bedside of my mother-in-law who was dying. My wife was holding her hand. There were 6 people in the room. And suddenly, Ali, my wife, at the precise moment her mother died, turned to the room, turned to all of us and went, all is well. All is well. She's not classically religious, so I couldn't quite understand what on earth should prompt my wife of 25 plus years then to say this at a time of terrible tragedy and poignancy. So afterwards I said to her, what did you mean all was well? And she said, well, surely you were there as well. And I went, where? And she said, well, I was in this space, this realm where everything was connected. I knew everything. It was infinite, but it wasn't. It was, I was there. And it was permeated with connection and connectivity and love. I mean, there was a feeling like she'd never had ever before. And she thought that's where she wanted to be. And that's where she wanted to stay. And she said, then I was back in the room and here I am. And all that knowledge I had when I was over there, I couldn't bring back with me. But over there, I knew everything. And I went, bloody hell, what is what is this? What is this thing she's talking about and describing?
Yeah.
Well, it turned out, I'm sure you know, but I didn't. It turned out to be something called a shared death experience. And I'd heard of near-death experiences, but I'd never heard of shared death experiences.
I'll take that brief moment just to say I recently spoke to William Peters, who's by many people considered the world's leading expert on the shared death experience. So if anybody wants to learn more, I'll put the link in the top corner or something. It should flash up about now. Anyway, please carry on.
Good. Well, I'll take advantage of that myself. I would love to pursue that. So anyway, long story short, I thought, okay, I've got to find out what this is. It was so paradigm shattering for me, and I wasn't even
absolutely
to have this described by someone I know intimately, etc., trust intimately, and all the rest of it. I thought I've got to find out what this is. Actually, that resulted in my writing. I couldn't do it professionally because I'm not, I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't have psychotherapeutic background. So I did it in the only way I knew I could, which was research the hell out of it. And then I wrote it up, but not as nonfiction. I wrote it up as fiction because I'm a thriller writer as well, in a book called The Grid. And it is all about consciousness. It has consciousness as its sort of backdrop. But even when that came out in 2019, I couldn't scratch that itch quite. So I wrote on my sort of intention board at the beginning of 2019, on January the 1st or whenever it was, I want to work with the world's leading researchers of consciousness. I had zero hope of making that happen because I had no contacts into that field at all beyond the research that's done for this book. But then about 4 months later, I met someone who somehow intuited that I was really into this subject, and being a philanthropist said, I'm going to fund you for the next 2 years to go and do effectively a PhD in consciousness. I never even asked. I didn't ask at all. It just happened. But people who work in this consciousness space know that weird synchronicities like that do happen. Yeah. So I took a year and a half to 2 years out. Actually, most of it was over the lockdown period. So it was brilliant. There was precious little else I could be doing except maybe writing a book, but doing this research. And at the end of the research, I thought, okay, well, that was interesting. I've done that. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. But now what do I do with this knowledge? Well, at that moment, a man called Robert Bigelow launches an essay contest as the inaugural gambit for his new venture, which was the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies, BICS.
Yeah, link in description for anybody that's interested. Please continue.
And the question was, provide the best evidence for the proof of the survival of consciousness post-death. In other words, after we die, does our consciousness go on? And I thought, blimey, all that research I did, I could answer that question. So I entered the essay competition, and to my enormous surprise, I am selected as one of the 29 winners. And so I trundle off to Las Vegas to pick up my prize. And the next thing I know is Mr. Bigelow is offering me a job as a research director of his new institute. And suddenly I am staring back at my intention board from 2019 because I'm now working alongside the world's greatest consciousness researchers. It took me through 2 or 3 years to do that, but whatever, 2.5 years. And there I was. So the crossover point, we've been talking about UFOs. So as anyone who sort of knows about Bob Bigelow is aware, his interests really are twofold. Primarily, or at least initially, it was UFOs and ET. But his follow-up interest was consciousness, and particularly...
Like me and you.
Well,
like me and you as well. Yeah.
Well, yeah, yes. I mean, funnily enough, but we can talk about that too, maybe another time, which is generally speaking, once you start on any point of the compass around consciousness, whether your entry point is UFOs or near-death experiences or remote viewing, whatever it happens to be, you're going to come to the consciousness core sooner or later. Uh, and anyway, Robert Bigelow's two interests, of course, which is the survival of consciousness post-death and UFOs, both converge in the whole consciousness studies field. So suddenly in the beginning of 2022, so last year, this is where I find myself in this consciousness, working alongside other consciousness luminaries with Robert Bigelow. And of course, Robert Bigelow was the sort of initial owner of Skinwalker Ranch, and people will be aware of, all the weird stuff that's happened on there. Every kind of sort of weird paraphysical manifestation has appeared on that ranch or around it. So, this is where I find myself. I'm suddenly in the middle of all of that. And it's where I still am, actually. So, but it is where the point, it's a nexus point for where UFOs and the whole sort of consciousness post-death thing, the survival post-death, do we go on after we die? Question merges. And Mr. Bigelow is always had been an interesting character to me because, of course, he surfaced very quickly after the New York Times broke its story in 2017 as actually the real recipient of the $22 million in funding that had been supplied by the Pentagon, specifically the Defense Intelligence Agency, to study the phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch. And there was an error in reporting in that original New York Times story that said it was the Pentagon, rather this body, ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, run by Lou Elizondo, that had received that money. Well, actually, it was Bigelow's company.
Was it NIDS?
No, NIDS was his predecessor organization. He shut NIDS down, and then soon afterwards bid for this Pentagon program, which was called ORSAP.
That's right.
Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Application Program, and won it and received $22 million in funding to go study weird stuff at Skinwalker Ranch predominantly, but other aspects of the UFO phenomenon as well. And that truly is where, in my mind, the whole consciousness field overlaps with the UFO phenomenon, in that there is, in this sort of Venn diagram, in the middle, there is a space where UFOs are neither real nor unreal. They are neither physical nor physical. And, this is, I think, where science needs to really apply its focus, because it's not just about what they are, but it's about what we are. Because, as we said earlier, we bring our own consciousness to the mirror or to the screen on which we observe this stuff. And a lot of things are contributing, in my view, to shaping the manifestations that appear on that reality screen, whether that's a UFO, a cryptozoological creature like Bigfoot or whatever, a ghost, a poltergeist incident, phenomenon. They're all mixed up, and we don't understand that much of it.
Yeah.
And I can't understand why science wouldn't want to be involved.
Me neither.
But it has, in some of its hallways, it's exhibiting a marked lack of curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. So you think then that there are potentially some connections, overlaps, as we keep like all these parallels, blurry lines, whatever. You think that there's potentially quite a bit going on there, but you wouldn't feel confident to say anything, to go in. What's the right word I'm looking for? To say anything with any certainty at all. I'm assuming you just kind of, it's an area you think needs way more study, and that's basically what we'll say for now about it.
Well, I think it needs way more study. I mean, I think there's loads to say about it,
Yeah.
even from our standpoint right now. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I've collected a massive data on the overlap between UFOs and sort of consciousness and reality and
Yeah.
whole sort of psychic space. We talked earlier about how I'd worked with Ingo Swann, who was the godfather of the original CIA remote viewing program. He was their original sort of star remote viewer. And Ingo had opened my eyes to that crossover aspect of those two phenomena. But we ain't going to scratch the surface in the few minutes we've got left. So I don't know where you want to go with it, Ben. But no, I've got loads to say on it. But it's just, there was the question of what my data is telling me and where science should be, prodding this field to extract its own data. And I'm not seeing too much evidence in that part. But I think, there are some fantastic researchers out there. We've named a few of them who are doing great work in this field and, beginning to sort out some of the wheat from the chaff as to what it is. But there's perhaps one of my final words on the subject is he or she who locks into a firm view of what this phenomenon is only going to be confounded and or disappointed, because it shows every sign of shifting with our own consciousness shifts as our consciousness shifts. So to stick a stake in the sand and go, here's what I believe this phenomenon is, and I'm going to be unmoving in my view of what it is a colossal mistake. And I've always said I reserve the right at any time to change my mind on this. But I do think that science will derive huge gains from investigating that space where consciousness overlaps with the UFO phenomenon. We're going to learn a great deal if science applies itself rigorously in that area. But, it's got to do a lot of shaping up first.
Definitely. Well, that's a rabbit hole for a future conversation. As we said earlier about something else, I think survival after death, that'll be another one to discuss in future. Obviously, as you said, there's loads of stuff there. There's like orbs and so many various elements that are really interesting that seem to be present in both. I think Jeff Mishlove told me about a case that he researched where somebody was in an afterlife realm. I can't remember if it was a medium or somebody having what kind of experience they were having, but basically these people were offered a UFO to go around and see stuff. So there's cases like that which are just wild. Last time you spoke to Jeff, I think it was last time. It was when you went out to pick up your award or whatever for the BICS essay competition, and you did a quick interview with Jeff and he asked you. I think he mentioned the PK Man to you, Ted Bundy, his book. Ted Owens, not the same Ted. The PK Man, Ted Owens. He mentioned him to you, and you weren't really very familiar with him. Have you looked into him much since then? Are you aware of Ted now? And I
bought Jeff Mishlove's book on it after that.
Yeah.
And whilst I'm a terrible dip in and out of books, so I've read about half of it, but I haven't read the whole thing. Yes, I am much more familiar with who he is and what he did.
Wild
Jeff
stuff.
himself is a first-rate, investigator of these things, and the book is very compelling. It's just you read the life of somebody like Ted Owens, and you think, God, we just don't understand the half of what we think we understand about the world. I mean, we are just scratching the surface, because that guy's skill sets in reality manipulation were just phenomenal.
Absolutely wild. And with the kind of the being able to manipulate like UFOs, either summon or predict UFOs. Again, a rabbit hole for another day. I got to let you get going, but I just had to mention that to see if you'd followed up on that. And it's just, yeah, the TEDO and stuff really threw me through a loop. Wild to listen to Jeff talking about that, because I spoke to Jeff as well, and we talked about that in a bit of detail when I spoke with him. Last thing, Nick, before I let you get going, is just if you got any last words or a message you want to send to anybody that's watched and listened to this today.
Well, first of all, I've enjoyed the conversation immensely. I do hope we'll get to have a follow-up about, some of the things that I touched on in my essay, which led me down a very interesting rabbit hole. But no, this is endlessly fascinating, at least to me. And maybe by the time we speak next, Ben, we might know a few more things in terms of answers out of Capitol Hill, but I'm not going to hold my breath because we're still in the middle of that walkback campaign, and we'll see. But I'm a hopeful person. I mean, I am. I like to think that if there is a sort of a great revelation about what UFOs are, we're going to learn a tremendous amount about ourselves at the same time. Yeah. And whilst I know that will lead to much flux and uncertainty, the hopeful being that I am says that I think and believe that, coming out of it will be better for it. But there will be a bit of churn and turmoil in between, I've no doubt. Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be... it's going to be some big paradigm shifting revelations we're going to have to face at some point soon. Anyway, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you very much, Nick. Looking forward to tackling more of these topics in future talks, hopefully soon. Wishing you all my best. Thanks again. Thank you. Thank you to Nick Cook for talking with me, and thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed our conversation and gained some new insights. Please see the description for relevant links, including a free download of Nick's essay on survival. If you like our interviews, please subscribe to continue unraveling the universe with us. And if you want to help us keep making content, you can contribute a small amount monthly via Patreon. Thank you.